Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at the world of Moses here at the beginning of our study of the book of Exodus. The first question we ask is about the date of the Exodus, and there's really two dates that are normally put forth. There's some others that have been suggested, but the early date, 1446 BC, and if you see 1444, 1441, I'm not going to quibble about give or take a few years, so we might round that up or down. The late date is usually around 1270 BC. Now that's a big difference between those two dates. The early date is given to us by a literal reading of 1 Kings chapter 6 verse 1, where it says it came about in the 480th year after the sons of Israel came out of the land of Egypt, in the 4th year of Solomon's reign over Israel, in the month of Ziv, which is the second month, that he began to build the house of the Lord. The building of the temple, we can put with some reasonable assurance, is around 960, 966 this is all BC, before Christ. And all we do is do the math. 480 years before that is 1446 BC. So that's just a literal reading of 1 Kings chapter 6, verse 1. You say, well, how do folks come up with that later date? And quite a few, even evangelical Christians, do that. How do they come up with that? They look at this passage and they said, that's not literally 480 years. That's just 12 generations of 40 years each. 12 times 40 is 480. And a lot of those people didn't, the generations were actually shorter. They, instead of being an average of 40 years, they might have been more like an average of 20 or 25 years or so. And so it was a much more brief era. I'm inclined to take this number with some degree of literalism. Now, is it possible it could have been 479? Yeah, but I think it's not rounded up that much. I think it's within at least the ballpark. And that means I have the early date, the 15th century date, versus the late date. That early date, if we go back to see who would be the pharaoh, and we can say probably around the time, and I tend to think the best candidate is a pharaoh by the name of Amenhotep II. He was of the 18th dynasty of Egypt. The late date, usually the pharaoh, and you sometimes hear this in movies where they refer to him as Ramses, Ramses II of the 19th dynasty. Now these are both within the New Kingdom, and I'll discuss what that means in just a moment. The early date, I'm getting that from 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 1, tells us 480 years. The late date, that 480 years, is said to be made up of 12 generations. 12 times 40 is 480, but it says that each generation was really shorter in duration. That later date points to Genesis chapter 47, verse 11, which makes reference to the land of Ramses. And yet, I think that maybe that reference to the land of Ramses, being in Genesis, can be understood to be a later update where somebody at a later date said, gee, we're not going to know what that land is, and so they called it that. Just like I might go into an early record that talks about New Amsterdam, and nobody knows what New Amsterdam is. And I changed that to say, well, that's really New York, what we call New York City. Was originally called New Amsterdam, just in case you didn't know. My earliest record that I have in Egyptian monuments of Israel is known as the Merenptah Stele. It's dated about 1220 BC, and it mentions Israel by name as a people group that are already in the land of Canaan. Now, let's go to Egypt itself. When I look at a modern map of Egypt, I have these nice, neat latitude and longitudinal lines. It looks sort of like a square on the west and on the south. That wasn't ancient Egypt. Ancient Egypt didn't really think of itself with that kind of map. Instead, Egypt was the land alongside the Nile River. Now, Egypt might own territory and might exercise influence over bigger areas than that, and they did for a great deal of its history. But Egypt proper was the land along the Nile River. So the Nile was the gift of Egypt. In fact, I would venture to say that if there was no Nile River, there would be no Egypt. This was the lifeblood of the land. Even today, if there were no Nile River, there would be no Egypt to speak of. Here's a satellite view looking from outer space down upon Egypt, and you can see the greenery both from the delta on the center part of our map, and then moving toward the lower left-hand corner, you can follow the Nile River and the greenery where it gives life and sustenance to that desert land. Here's a close-up. This is an aerial view still, and you can see the Nile River and the greenery on either side, and then you get away from that and you're out in the desert. So that if you're sailing up or down the Nile, and if you want to sail down the Nile, you just drift because the river is going that way. And if you want to sail up the Nile, you usually put up a sail because the prevailing winds tend to go south. And it looks like there's mountains in the distance. That's not mountains. That's just the edge of the river valley. You get up to the top of that, and you're not a mountain peak where it goes down on the other side. Instead, that's just the flat area of the desert beyond. Egyptologists normally think of the history of Egypt as divided into three kingdoms. You begin with sort of an archaic period, but then there was the Old Kingdom. This was dynasties 3 through 6, and this was the era of Great Pyramid building. This is when they built the Great Pyramid, and it was the building time of Egypt, where Egypt was revolutionary. And this is all before the days of Abraham. But then things fell apart in Egypt. You'd had what was called the First Intermediate Period, where Egypt actually broke into bits and pieces. The country stopped existing as a single unified country, but after that it came together again. In the Middle Kingdom, I have Dynasty 12, actually Dynasties 11 and 12, and this is the era of the biblical patriarchs. This is Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and it's during this time that Joseph and the Israelites come into Egypt. But then after that, things fell apart again. The nation actually fell apart. It was disunified. Invaders came in, known as the Hyksos. We're going to talk about them in just a moment. And then we have, again, once the Hyksos are driven out, beginning around 1587 BC, I have a new kingdom that comes in and manages to rise up. And it's going to be this new kingdom that will be the period of Moses and the Exodus. Eventually you'll have a third intermediate period, but that's long after our story here. So that if the Old Kingdom was the period of the Great Pyramid building, they built some pyramids in the Middle Kingdom. They were sort of trying to get back to their roots, but they were building those out of mud brick. They were a lot smaller, and most of them haven't survived. If the Old Kingdom was great building and the Middle Kingdom was great economy, the New Kingdom was great military, because during this time, Egypt's military went out over most of the known world. Egypt had allowed the Israelites to come in and settle in a place known in the Bible as Goshen. Seems to be on the east side of the Delta region. And we actually have a wall painting pictured below of Semitic peoples coming. Now, I'm not saying these are necessarily Israelites. I'm not sure that there are. But they are Semitic peoples who are coming into Egypt. And that was considered just a bit unusual, because Egyptians normally didn't like other people coming into Egypt. They wanted Egypt for Egyptians. So we have this second intermediate period we mentioned, where after the Middle Kingdom, we have these outsiders. They are called, in some writings, the Hyksos, the chieftains of a foreign hill country. Or we know them normally as the Hyksos, rulers of countries. We used to think it meant shepherd kings. It doesn't. Rulers of countries. And they came into Egypt, and when they did, they brought with them a new innovation. They were Semitic peoples, and they brought with them the six-spoked chariot wheel. Now this was like the invention of the tank is to the modern world. This allowed groups of soldiers to rush in, not just at a walking speed, but to rush in and shoot the enemy, and that was considered revolutionary. And eventually the Egyptians are going to adopt that as well. So I have Egypt during the period of the Hyksos ruling, not all of Egypt, but the Hyksos are ruling northern Egypt, what we call Lower Egypt, because it's down lower. And then from Thebes, I have that's known as Upper Egypt, even though it's down on our map. That's known as Upper Egypt because it's up higher. And Thebes had their own pharaohs, their own dynasties, but eventually the pharaohs at Thebes drove out the Hyksos and they reunified Egypt. And this is going to be the period of the 18th dynasty. They are the ones that had driven out Egypt, driven out the Hyksos. Here's it's a site of a treasure chest. It's sort of an ornate painting. On the other side, there's the pharaoh defeating Nubians to the south. But here they are. The pharaoh is defeating Semitic peoples, and it's in such a way that they notice they've adopted the chariot wheel and the chariots of the Hyksos. They're using their own weapons against them and driving out the Hyksos from Egypt. We're not going to go back to pyramid building. Instead, the pharaohs of this dynasty, they buried their dead always on the west side of the Nile, because the pyramids are all built on the west side of the Nile too. They would even say when you're going to die, you're going to go west. We say he passed away, he kicked the bucket. They would say he went west. Valley of the Kings was the burial place for the pharaohs of this dynasty. And so you have Thebes as the capital in the south, but Memphis will be the capital in the north, with one pharaoh ruling over all of Egypt. It's also a period of great building. Here I'm taking you to the mortuary temple of Hatshepsut, who was one of the pharaohs, and yet quite an unusual pharaoh, because Hatshepsut was a woman. For a time, Egypt was going to be ruled by a woman. And you ask, how did that take place? And that is going to be a wonderfully involved story, in which perhaps we can see elements of the biblical story come and intertwine with that. So here's some of the pharaohs of the 18th dynasty. It was Ahmose who succeeds in driving out the Hyksos, and then we have a number of pharaohs. We're just going to mention them by name: Amenhotep II, the first, and Thutmose I. But Thutmose I, he and his wife have no male heir, and so, but he does have a daughter by the name of Hatshepsut. Now, what he does, he arranges for Hatshepsut to marry another person, Thutmose II, who's going to be the pharaoh, and they marry and they have children, but their children are again daughters. And you say, well, where's the pharaoh in that? And Thutmose II dies, and meanwhile Thutmose II had a son by a different wife by the name of Thutmose III, but he's not quite old enough, and so he's sort of the heir apparent. But when Thutmose II dies, Hatshepsut becomes the pharaoh. She initially perhaps was going to be just regent, but she herself takes on the role and the title. Here she is, and here she is depicted with the royal beard. You would take the beard, you wouldn't actually grow it, you would strap it on. You'd sort of have a little chin strap. And she's depicted wearing that same royal beard as she reigns for a number of years as pharaoh. But when she dies, when Hatshepsut dies, and it was a wonderful time in Egypt during her reign. You had the economy growing, but when she dies, her stepson Thutmose III is going to come to the throne, and what he's going to do is all throughout Egypt he will erase any mention of his stepmother. We're not going to talk about that time in Egypt when Egypt was ruled by a woman. And indeed, as far as Egyptologists were concerned, that history was all but forgotten. He would go and he would plaster over. Of course, the plaster eventually fell off, and then they thought, well, gee, who is this person? We'd never even heard of this person, Hatshepsut. And oddly enough, she has a feminine sounding, feminine prefix at the end of her name. The et part, the Hatshepsut, that's always a woman. And so they puzzled over that, and then they learned the truth. That her very existence had been covered up by Thutmose III, who now came to the throne, said, we're not going to talk about her anymore. And Thutmose III becomes the greatest military conqueror that Egypt had ever seen. In the space of 18 years, he's going to make 17 different campaigns all the way to the Euphrates River, taking whatever isn't nailed down, subjugating these areas, and each year he's going to come back home because you don't want to spend too much time out of Egypt because Egypt is where you want to be. And so he'd make these campaigns through Canaan, through Aram, all the way to the Euphrates, attacking the ancient kingdom of Mitanni, and then picking up whatever wasn't nailed down and coming back home again. Now, when Thutmose III dies, his son comes to the throne, Amenhotep II. And Thutmose III had been, actually, we know from his mummy, he was sort of short. Amenhotep II, his son, was a great big guy, almost a giant by comparison. And he's going to come to the throne, and he says, I'm going to be just like Dad. I'm going to do those kind of invasions too. Amenhotep II began his reign being just as militarily strong as his father. He went down to Nubia, put down a revolt. He takes his chariots and he goes up into Canaan. But then, after the 9th year of his reign, something happens, and he comes home to Egypt, and he never sets foot out of Egypt again. And we don't hear about any more conquests. We don't hear about any more raids or anything like that. Suddenly, something big has changed in Egypt. I think it's the events of the Exodus. When Amenhotep II dies, his son, Thutmose IV, comes to the throne. And when Thutmose IV comes to the throne, the first thing he does is to have a monument, a big stone slab, notice you can still see it there, standing between the feet of the Sphinx. And that stone, now the Sphinx is much older. The Sphinx goes all the way back to the Old Kingdom. But this monument tells a story about how Thutmose IV, when he was much younger, a prophet had come to him and told him that he would become pharaoh in place of his older brother. It was always the older brother that came to the throne first. And remember what happens in the Bible. You have the death of the firstborn. And I can't say for sure that firstborn was this older brother, but it's striking that Thutmose IV, when he comes to the throne, he's not the firstborn of his father. There was an older brother that was supposed to reign, and now he's died. So I have Amenhotep II. I'm suggesting that he's the pharaoh of the Exodus. I have an older brother, who died, and then Thutmose IV becomes the pharaoh following him. After Thutmose IV, I go down, after he's lived and died, I come down to Amenhotep III. In the case of Amenhotep III, there was a tablet that was found, a whole series of tablets, but one in particular that I want to talk about. They are known as the Amarna tablets because they were found in a place called Amarna that had been built up, a bit after Amenhotep III. So it was sort of a library book, I guess you could call it. But this was a letter, and was a letter written from the king of Jerusalem to Amenhotep III. And in this letter he says, the Habiru are plundering all the lands of the king. If no troops come in this very year, then all the lands of the king are lost. So that by this time, this is 40 years after Amenhotep II, after the Pharaoh of the Exodus, I have a report from the king of Jerusalem saying there's these invaders, these Habiru. Sounds a little bit like Hebrew. Don't want to say there's a direct connection, but it sounds like that. And they're plundering, and they're coming in, and they're taking the land, and we need help. And by the way, let me just tell you the rest of the story. No help came. So that eventually those lands are lost to an invading group. And again, I think that's the story of Joshua and the Israelites coming into the land. Now the next pharaoh after that, and by this time there's not any really connection with Israel and Egypt, except I just want to fill in the blanks here. There's a pharaoh by the name of Amenhotep IV, but he's going to change his name to Akhenaten. Akhenaten, and it's a name that signifies Aten as the sun god, and he's saying, let's do something different. Let's worship just one God. Now, maybe he's getting this idea from a few generations earlier when these Israelite slaves had been worshippers of one God. And look what happened then. He doesn't mention that. He says, let's worship, and the God he wants to worship is Aten, the sun god. And he leads Egypt to become a monotheistic country. Now, it's not going to last. Once he dies, his son, who's just a child, actually his name is originally Tutankhaten, but his name is quickly changed back to a more politically correct Tutankhamen, and he's only 9 years old. And so the nation goes back to its polytheistic ways, and they return to that old religious system. But Egypt now is very, very weak militarily. It's still a superpower, but it's nowhere like it had been back in the old days of Thutmose III. And really, Tutankhamun's claim to fame isn't any greatness, but the fact that his tomb was so small and out of the way, it was discovered not until 1922 by Howard Carter in the Valley of the Kings. Here again is that Valley of the Kings where the pharaohs of the 18th dynasty were buried. And his tomb is discovered. You can actually go to it today. And it was intact. Usually, they'd found a number of tombs there, but they had already been emptied by grave robbers. Usually, people that dug the tombs would come back at a later date and then take whatever they could get. But this tomb was intact. It had been buried and forgotten. And as we look at the relics of Tutankhamun's tomb, we're reminded that it's this same dynasty, it wasn't him himself, but this same dynasty that was the Egypt of the Exodus. That when we look at these kind of relics, we can be reminded that it's this culture that was involved in coming out of Egypt, and not only coming out of Egypt, but in building the various things. For example, the ornaments and the furniture that we find in the tabernacle. And so there's a connection here. When you walk through the museum in Cairo, and you walk through that part that's dedicated to the 18th dynasty, you look at that and you remember that the folks that built, the Hebrews that built the tabernacle had learned their trade in this same Egypt. You think about that.